Okay, I think we'll make a start and welcome everybody to this workshop on looking at new opportunities related to waste fishing gear. And this particular seminar or webinar is brought by myself, Professor Martin Charter of the Centre for Sustainable Design at University for Creative Arts, particularly as part of a new project called the Blue Circular Economy Project that is funded by the European Union. And it's a follow-up to another project that ran for 3 years called Circular Ocean. So that is potentially another useful resource to Google on. And it'd be great if people can stay muted. Various people I know are going to start to come in now. So if people can just mute themselves. If you have any questions, please use the chat box. And what we'll have is an opportunity to, if you can pose some questions, and at different times during the workshop, I will try and tackle some of those questions. I hope that we'll be able to finish in around about 1 hour. So without further ado, I will we'll start the presentation. Get the technology working, which is always a challenge. Right. So as I said, this is really around eco-innovation, trying to create products from used fishing nets, ropes, and components. But also, as I get more into this topic, it's also peripherals, and I'll explain what that means. So basically, we have my centre, the Centre for Sustainable Design, has a lot of experience in working with small and micro enterprises around more generally eco-innovation, and we have maybe 500 or 600 companies through our programs over the years, and that was documented in a booklet called Eco Innovate, which we also adapted to this particular sector. These are some other projects we got involved in looking at eco-innovation and particularly micro-enterprises. So in this particular topic, well, really what we've seen emerge over the last, 5 to 6, 7 years is growing media concern about ocean marine plastics. And what we've seen is particularly very high-profile documentaries such as Blue Planet 1 and Blue Planet 2, produced by Sir David Attenborough, that have been distributed worldwide. And what we've seen is more and more pictures of ocean marine plastics, in the ocean, and, emotional pictures like this of not just the marine plastics, but the fishing nets and fishing gear tangling up with seals and dolphins and other marine mammals. So there's this emotional link to the topic. But what we also see in many ports now is huge piles of nets that are contaminated and just really often just sitting there because there is no incentive to recycle them. So often what we've found from our research in Northern Europe is generally those fishing nets, will generally go to landfill, or they'll get burnt, or a significant proportion will end up in the ocean. And the big game in town now, particularly in Europe, is the passing of the Single-Use Plastics Directive in March this year, which effectively is not just tackling issues like straws that you may have heard of, but also it's putting in place an extended producer responsibility scheme for fishing nets, ropes, and components, putting the responsibility on the net manufacturers to take back and recycle and reuse those fishing nets in different member states. The legislation is still very emergent, but it has been passed. I also note that Canada has also passed some similar legislation recently. So what's the challenge? Well, according to the UN, 640,000 tons of fishing nets and ropes go into the sea each year. But through our previous project, Circular Ocean, we found this figure to be very unreliable. and based on a whole series of assumptions. And what we found was actually the range of, or the proportion of nets and ropes, etc., as a proportion of all of the marine plastics could be between 10 and 70%. So it's much more significant than has previously been discussed, but also very badly documented. So it's a classic management problem. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So we're still at a very early stage of trying to understand this problem, particularly of the discarded fishing nets, ropes, components and peripherals. It's a very fragmented picture, and really we're very much at the stage of trying to collect the data, and we're a long way off from wisdom. So there's been relatively little research around the issue of the nets in the oceans. So what are fishing nets, ropes, components and peripherals? Well, they look a bit like this. They include, generally three types of polymers: polyethylene, polypropylene, or polyalamide, which is nylon. And then it can include things like metal, it can include rubber, it can include lots of different types of materials. So it's much broader than just the fishing nets. And if you expand that into aquaculture gear for commercial growing of fish and shellfish, there's another set of gear out there and another set of problems associated with that. So what we also found when we did a disassembly exercise of fishing nets, there is a number of these small plastic components as well, which, unless you're in the sector, you wouldn't think about. So the opportunity is then, how could we convert those into products? And what I'll give you now is some examples of actual products that are in the market at the moment. In the previous project, Circular Ocean, we tried to document the products that had sold at least one unit in the market around the world. We actually only found about 20 companies at that stage, about 18 months ago, that were selling products. There was about 30 different types of products and about 20 different companies providing those products. And I break these down into six areas where one could potentially generate income. So one could potentially generate income from the repair of the fishing nets. And we find already the smaller fishermen, they will repair their nets just as part of normal practice, because it's a costly element for them, the fishing nets. The commercial fishermen will often, in a number of instances, will send back their nets to the net manufacturers, who will then repair them for them and send them back. So simply because the cost of some of these nets are perhaps up to 200,000 to 250,000 euros. They can be very, very expensive. So there's a business around repair services. Also reuse of the net for other areas. Reverse logistics, so collecting those nets to take them for recycling. And indeed, there is a specialist company called Norvia that does this in Norway. Then there's also another company that have developed a de- and repolymerization process for nylon fishing nets. The company is called Aquafil, and it's produced a second life thread called Econile. And one of the points that we found is an increasing number of designers of clothing are starting to use the Econile fiber instead of virgin fiber. So there's a growth amongst small designers starting to use the fiber.
Hello.
Please, can you mute yourself? Thank you. So there are a different range of products, and lastly, at the bottom of the, if you like, the environmental hierarchy, there's a number of companies trying to create fuel from the plastics, which, whilst not being necessarily the environmentally preferable option for fishing communities who have little resources, if you can't use the polymers to a higher level, maybe it's a legitimate strategy. So, picking out a few of these, reuse. So, for example, there's an Italian company called Verdura, as you can see here, who's making shoes from the fishing nets. So they're reshaping the nets into shoes. And these shoes, believe it or not, are selling at about 200 euros. So, and the company started with crowdfunding and is now growing and looking for other funding opportunities. There's also a small company in Germany called BraceNet, who are reusing the ropes or certain types of ropes to produce bracelets and necklaces. There's the what I call regeneration, which is the canal example. So this is the second life fiber that is produced from the nylon, that is then being used in a whole range of products, including socks, swimwear, and even carpet tiles. And then we have materials recycling. So basically, what you have is some companies who are creating pellets, plastic pellets from the fishing nets, and then starting to use them in injection molding. So injection molding of products. So, and I'll come back to an example of that. So in theory, what one could do is produce a fishing box using second life pellets from fishing nets. So it's a relatively simple product. You could create that out of fishing net pellets. So this idea of substituting from virgin polymers in fishing areas to recycled materials. We haven't seen anybody do this yet, but for me, it's an opportunity. You put the fishing nets through a pelletization process, produce pellets, and then use that within injection molding to produce the boxes. You could also similarly do this with these simple components. We have the first commercial company, that is producing filament for 3D printing. And there's a company called Fishy Filaments, and they're based in the southwest of the UK. And their business is not the 3D printing process, it's producing the filament that for others to produce the products. There's also a very interesting company called Burio that is based between Chile and the US. And they have a very holistic sustainability model that is really environmental, social, and economic, in the sense they work very closely with the fishermen to collect the nets, who then clean the nets. Then they send the nets to their small factory in Santiago. They then pelletize the nets, and then they 3D print, and then they produce a range of different products. But they also provide a percentage of this income from their products back into the fishing communities. So they're reinvesting in educational projects. So it's really environmental, economic, and social. So their great product is a skateboard. So they're making skateboards out of fishing nets. They'd ideally like to make it purely out of the fishing net polymers, but because of the nature of the product, they have to include some rubber to give the flexibility for the skateboard. They also have partnered with a company to produce sunglasses. They've also produced frisbees linked to the Jack Johnson music tour. They've also produced fins for surfboards for the sea. They've also produced a game to raise awareness of the issue of fishing nets. Jenga, some called Jenga game. So it's a game purely made out of the polymers from the fishing nets. And also they're now producing enough pellets from their process. They're now starting also to sell the pellets to other companies. So they're, for example, now working with an office equipment company or office furniture company called Human Scale to produce office chairs using the polymers. And then they help to differentiate from normal, if you like, Me Too office chairs, in that one chair is using 14 pounds of fishing nets. So it adds more value, it raises awareness of the issue. So do we have any short questions at this stage or short observations? If not, it may be a bit early. If there's nothing coming immediate, please, as I go through the next section, think about any questions or observations, and if you want to, just ask at the next stage. So, get the technology working again, I hope. Right. So we go back into a little bit of theory. So part of this whole approach, thinking practically, is to move from the so-called, cradle to grave thinking, where we're extracting materials or producing polymers from oil, in effect, where those products end up in landfill or whatever, to a more circular approach, where the designers of the fishing gear should be thinking about how they could, look at opportunities for circularity throughout each stage of the life cycle. So, in effect, we're moving from this linear economy to this more circular economy, where, in my definition, and I just have produced a book called Designing for the Circular Economy, the idea of circular economy, to me, or product circularity, is about how you retain value in products, components, and materials for as long as possible in economic and social systems. So you're almost crossing out the word waste. You're focusing on value. So circular economy, you can argue, is dealing with a biological system and a technical system. Particularly in the biological system, you're looking at, renewable materials and composting those materials. But in the technical system, which are metals, plastics, etc., it's how long you can extend the life cycle, if you like, of those materials. So a key part of this process is not end of life; it's the use phase. How you can bring the materials back, reuse it, and keep that value in the system. So here, looking at this slide here, we might think about, could we share the nets? Could small cooperatives share the nets? Could we, again, expand the repair of those nets? Could we, reuse the nets by incorporating design for disassembly? So if we get a section of the net that is broken, could we repair that net with a new section? So we're just extending the life of the product. And that goes right through into, if the nets are damaged, then, could we reuse the remaining materials to produce, recycled material for pellets, for injection molding, or for 3D printing? So it's about retaining that value in the system. What we perhaps need to think about now is the life cycle. So if you want to move forward to producing products from fishing nets, what are some of the things you need to think about broadly? We'll go into more detail, but to start off the process, just some thoughts here. Well, clearly you need to collect and store the fishing nets from somewhere, and the options are to collect them from the open sea, to work maybe with divers or scientific teams to identify nets, to then collect the nets. Basically, also to work with harbors, maybe to store those nets, and also to look at, could you collect material using beach cleans? And basically, we've seen a significant growth globally in NGOs and civil society organizations collecting nets. This is a huge growth of motivated people wanting to clean up the beaches. So could we perhaps look at, collecting the better quality nets and reuse them in some form of products may be sold to generate income to go back into beach cleaning or something like this. So how do we collect those nets and how do we store those nets? Then we go into thinking about, well, how, the issues around the production of the nets, repair, reuse, recycling. We'll go into more detail on this. We then obviously need to think about how we would sell any products that we produce from the fishing nets, either through reuse type of products or manufactured type of products. So working through local shops, maybe online businesses, setting up an online platform for your business, maybe selling your product into a retail chain, a small retail chain or a large retail chain, or maybe working cooperatively with other design entrepreneurs or others where, you are, each selling each other's products in some form. So different types of cooperative models. You also need to think about the use phase of the product. So are you going to sell your products for people to own? Are you going to sell the products for people to lease or rent? Also, is there a business opportunity to, help service the fishing nets? So, cleaning businesses to clean the nets prior to producing the materials. Or as some people looking at new business models where they're looking at the overall experience. So I'll come back to that example of one company that has a business in, I think it's the Netherlands, whereby you pay to go and collect plastics to clean up the canals in the Netherlands. So you're paying for that experience to clean up the nets, clean up the plastics. They're not doing it with fishing nets, doing it with plastics. And then what that company is then doing is producing the boats for that experience out of the recycled plastic. But the customer is getting experience, of helping to clean up, the canals. But there's no reason why you couldn't think of a similar model for fishing nets. And if you wanted to extend the life of, the material, the fishing nets, you could think about a repair service. You could think about, how you design the product to be easier to disassemble at the end of life, because it's quite a large labor cost to disassemble large nets. If you could somehow make it easier for people to disassemble sections of the nets, that would reduce the labor costs and perhaps make some of the process more viable. You could also look at other models for remanufacturing the nets. And as mentioned previously, perhaps you could also look at 3D printing of products using filament from the fishing nets. So just in summary here, I won't, I'll just briefly repeat it. So some of the options are repair businesses, simple reuse of the nets, maybe into football goals, into bags, golf nets or something like this. Other crafted reuse options included bags, accessories, things like this. So just simply reusing the net in a different form. Manufacturing that is obviously a bit more, is more costly and requires manufacturing equipment. You could produce skateboards or frisbees. There may be recycling business opportunities to use chemical recycling and basically aquafill to produce that have a chemical recycling process. There is another company called Plastics Global that uses mechanical recycling to recycle the fishing nets. But the reality is, in Europe at the moment, there is really only 2 recycling operations for the fishing nets. And the big challenge with the new legislation linked to the extended producer responsibility scheme for the fishing nets is, you're going to need recyclers throughout Europe to be able to do the recycling of the nets. If we've got 2 recyclers in Europe, it's not practical at the moment. So there's going to be a need to expand the recycling capacity around the coastal areas, in each member state. And we're a long way off that. So the legislation is still really in its early days. Then other business opportunities linked to service businesses, such as sorting or collecting or cleaning those nets ready for example, to produce pellets. Because often the nets that come in are very contaminated. They need to be cleaned to get good material. And generally what you see is that the nylon, because there are markets for the nylon nets, move quite quickly. So you don't see so much nylon in the ports because there's a market for it. The big problem is with the polypropylene or the polyethylene. So it's opportunity to ask any questions or make any observations, or I can sort of move on and other ideas and thoughts can emerge as we go forward. So I think I'll do that as I'm not seeing anything come out yet. So again, get the technology working. So now going into a lot more detail. So I've given you a bit of background, some thoughts there, on issues, some examples of products, some examples of issues you need to think about. So if you've got an idea for a product, what are some of the things you actually need to do as an entrepreneur or a micro-entrepreneur? Well, some of you need to start off by, obviously, what is your concept? Is it a new business model, a new type of product, a service, or a product-service combination? Are you looking at it being a premium, a quality product, and therefore higher price, or a lower quality product with a lower price? So, for example, the Verdura shoes are, you could argue they're a higher quality product. So maybe they're customized, they're using a lot of design skills, whereas maybe the bracelets are much easier to produce and you can produce those in volume. So, what type of product are you looking at? Are you looking at high quality craftsmanship and design, or more to do with industrial production? As a micro entrepreneur or a startup, what is your ambition for your company? Small scale? Are you going to do it part-time? Is it producing single items or batches of items, or you're going to look really at an industrial model where you're moving into so-called flow production? So really looking at a significant business model. Most of what we've seen at the moment is in the job and batch side of this. So it's very small volume, often very crafted type of products. The Burio products are probably companies, probably one of the more advanced final product companies. So will the fishing nets be a key visible feature of the product, or will they somehow be a secondary feature of the product? So will you use those nets, to highlight the product, or is it somehow within the product? So what is your value proposition? So what value will you be delivering to your customers? And indeed, who are your customers for your product? Is it consumers? Is it businesses? Or is it government? So, for example, one area that might be business opportunities is to sell to local government who may be trying to practice green procurement. And maybe if they buy construction products, maybe there might be an opportunity to substitute some of the construction products somehow using fishing nets. For example, if you can visualize, buildings, sometimes they use nets there to make sure that items don't fall from a high height on people's heads. Could you reuse fishing nets in that and substitute those other nets? So how does your product differentiate from other offerings on the market? What is your unique selling proposition? Are there any other competitive offerings in the market? And what type of business model is relevant for your offering? Could the fact that it is derived from fishing nets or ropes or etc. be something that differentiates your product from others in the market? I'll now go into a number of examples of business models some which use fishing nets or are being used by those that are using fishing nets, and some that are from other sectors that might be appropriate to this area. So, as I mentioned before, Burio, they produce products from pellets, in effect, that are derived from fishing nets, and they use injection molding. So that's a particular model they use. An illustrative example is Mud Jeans. They produce, so this is, sorry, I should have said this is a circular business model. So Mud Jeans, they rent jeans rather than sell jeans. So could you actually produce clothing using for example, EcoNile fiber or some other second life fiber, and just rent the clothes and take them back, repair them, resell them. Deso, again an illustrative example, but it could be relevant here. They offer carpet tiling solutions and carpet solutions where they include in the business model, they will service and maintain those floors. So if there's a problem with the flooring, they will go in and repair it or whatever. Already Interface Floor are producing carpet tiles that are reusing fishing nets. So, similarly, could you provide a full service where you would repair the tiles? Another circular business model is reverse logistics. This is a company, as I mentioned earlier on, called Norvia, who basically will go to the ports and then they collect those fishing nets and then they distribute those fishing nets to companies like Aquafil to produce the EcoNile fiber. So they're a logistics company. Then, as I mentioned, another circular business model is Fishy Filaments, who are collecting the nylon to produce the filaments for 3D printing from the fishing nets. And the second one is experiential business models, so a business model using experience. So I understand that Aquafil, who produce the EcoNile fiber, offer guided tours to let customers see their production processes. I physically haven't been there, and I know they're very secretive about their production process, how they and repolymerize the nylon. So I wonder if certain parts of that process you can't see. But Body Shop, the cosmetics company, had a similar model many years ago where you could go and visit the factory, see how the Body Shop cosmetics would use. So it's opening up the production process. As I touched on earlier, this company called Plastic Whale, where they offer events where customers can take part in a collection process. So they can collect those plastic bottles in the ocean and in canals, and you can look at something similar for fishing nets. Maple XO, another illustrative example, they offer maker workshops where customers participate hands-on in crafting of a product. So could a craftsperson offer some sort of workshop where they were showing people how to make a product using fishing nets? And indeed, there is a company that has a similar model in the north of Scotland that are making floor mats from ropes. And they offer the workshop, and then the leader of the workshop will show you how to make the mat from the ropes, and then I believe you then take your own mat away. Open source business models. So an example of this is Precious Plastics, and basically they've open sourced the design of 3 production pieces of production technology, so you could make your own machines. So basically, you can go onto the internet, you can download the blueprint for these machines, and then you can make them yourselves, where effectively you can put in plastics in the front of the process, and out at the end comes products. So we work with a company or a design agency to test whether we could do this with fishing nets. And then we were able to produce a small product from that process. It's a lot more complicated to feed in the fishing nets because of the characteristics of the fishing nets, but we were able to produce something. So one could look at this technology for sorting, and there's 3 types of technology, and you can build these machines. For the 3 machines, they reckon for about €2,000 just from found materials that you can get. So you can build your own machines. So Open Desk, this is a platform that charges people to sell their finished products and customized products. So basically, you could pay to gain access onto this website that promotes small designer makers, and this provides a platform to sell your products using the fishing nets. And again, as I touched on a little bit earlier, this company called Afraid Not in the north of Scotland, they provide training and workshops for individuals and communities, particularly to make products using waste fishing nets, such as using ropes from the fishing nets to produce mats, door mats for the home. Social enterprise model or business model. So Burio, also apart from having a circular business model, they involve customers, the local community as co-creators of their product. So they involve the fishermen in the process. Healthy Seas in, I believe it's the Netherlands, they've set up a social business where they work with various partners, and then they're producing producing socks using economic fibers. 2 other companies, Planet Love Life and Ruby Moon, they're much more socially driven, so they present themselves as businesses as a force for good, and they're both producing products from the fishing net, for using fishing nets, and then they donate a percentage of their profits to good causes, like supporting women entrepreneurs in developing countries. You've got collaborative business models. So BraceNet in Germany, they've established partnerships with fishermen to take the nets, and they also are working with disabled people to make the bracelets and the necklaces. So again, they're working with different groups. And networks run by Interface Floor. Again, they're working in Southeast Asia, where they're working again with fishermen and other organizations to collect the fishing nets, to then send to Aquafil to produce the Econal fiber, and then they're reusing those in their carpet tiles. So it's a whole model from collecting the materials, working with another organization, and then using that material in their products. So, any questions? Is it making sense? Is it interesting? Anybody have anything to say, or shall we move on to the next set of slides? So I'll move on to the next set of slides. So the next thing you need to think about is how you source the used fishing nets, etc. So you need to think, how are you going to collect those fishing nets? You know, are you going to set up some network or system to collect those fishing nets, working maybe with harbors or fishermen or divers, for example, where you can identify where the fishing nets? Could you partner with harbor authorities, with waste management companies, with NGOs or beach clean organizations to collect those nets, etc.? You need to think about how you're going to clean those nets to remove toxins and chemicals and debris. because often those nets will get a lot of biological material when they're landed, and you have to clean those nets to get good material. What you also see, particularly in some of the aquaculture nets, they are also covered in, but the very good quality nylon is also covered in grease, greases that has high copper content in them. That is potentially polluting, but they use that to try and keep pests, away from the fish that may, in effect, kill the fish. But you land those types of fishing gear, very good quality nylon, but they're contaminated because they have the grease, they have almost is contaminated material. So what is now being looked at is new processes to try and remove those grease and those metals to get to that good quality nylon. So could you actually consider, instead of going through the whole process of sorting, cleaning, etc., and also drying the nets? Why do I say drying? Because what happens is a lot of the polymers are absorbic, so they absorb salt water. So particularly if you take those, those polymers to be heated for injection molding or for 3D printing, if the nets are not dry, it ruins the production process because water comes out of the nets. So you don't have to just clean them. You also have to dry them as well. We only found that out through a practical exercise. So, but you could actually just say, well, maybe you're a fashion or clothing designer. Maybe you just buy Econile fiber, and use that Econile fiber. You're substituting from virgin polymer. You're using a second life material. But, maybe you would want to look at the whole process. So next question is research and development. Do you have the necessary skills to produce your product or service? Could you work with a research lab or a university to produce your product? Could you partner with others to get access to the technology to produce your product? Could you also work with other local companies in some form, work with plastic shredders or plastic molding companies that might be located in port areas or harbour areas? So could you collaborate with other companies in your area? Could you consider 3D printing? So basically, my understanding is the fishy filament 3D fishy filaments can be used in many 3D printers. So, could you produce a product using that filament, using a conventional 3D printer? Could you even go as far as reconfiguring a precious plastics machine or machines to produce some products? Product design examples, well, in the Circular Ocean product section, if you Google Circular Ocean, you'll see a report on all sorts of products. I've mentioned a number of products. I've shown you the Vajura shoes, but we've seen is some companies producing, reusing crab pots, for example, for baskets for bicycles. So there's a range of companies doing different things and producing different types of products. So again, in taking your idea forward, what are some of the marketing issues you need to think about? So if you've got a product idea, you've thought through how you're going to source the material, the process of how you're going to produce it, for example. Well, who is your target audience? Again, is it consumers? Is it business? Is it government? So maybe you might be selling a product to, for example, surfers in a local tourist area. Maybe think of a product for tourists. Maybe you think about producing products for the marine industry. So maybe those fishing boxes, maybe, for example, there's maybe a business opportunity there. Or as I mentioned before, maybe you could make some sort of construction products for local government who are wanting to develop green procurement. So one example is one of the partners in the project. They are using and doing a lot of testing, reusing fishing nets in concrete blocks to then improve the stability and strength of those concrete blocks. So could it be used to reinforce other materials? So who is your audience? How are you going to raise awareness of your product or product service? Increasingly, I think we're going to start to see more questions over products that claim to be including ocean marine plastics. We already see some companies, I'm not going to name those companies, but major companies promoting what looks like the fact they're using fishing nets in their products. But the question is, are the polymers from the Second Life nets 0.0001% of the polymers? So effectively, are they greenwashing people over this? So I suspect that we'll start to see more NGO activity in this area and perhaps a tightening up of claims. So one needs to be quite careful over how you promote this. You'll obviously need to think about how your customers are going to purchase the products. Are they going to purchase online? Are they going to purchase it through stores, maybe in coastal areas, maybe through hotels in port areas, for example? And how are you going to get your product to your customers? And how are you going to deal with after-sales service? Are you going to encourage customers, if the product gets broken, to encourage them to send it back and then you'll repair it, either for free or for a small fee or free? So my understanding is Boreo have a model like this where if you break your product, you can send it back, and then they may provide then the second product at a lower price or something. So they're really trying to encourage the closed loop and reuse the material. So branding, what is your key brand message and your core story? That's the question. How did the idea emerge? What is the story behind the product? How do you go about as a startup or a small company communicating your vision, your values, and your story, maybe through photographs, videos, blogs, etc.? How do you involve customers, employees, stakeholders in your brand? Could you co-brand with other products? There's a couple of examples there of companies that are doing this. So funding, very important. How do you fund your startup? What do you actually need to start your business, to produce your first product, or to move to produce your prototype and then your product? So how much you need to do that, and what is your basic business plan? What types of funding is available to you? Can you self-fund the business? Friends and family, overdraft, credit cards? Would you have to go out to bank loans, venture capital, angel investors? Could you go to a startup or incubator hub that might fund you to start your activities? Or could you use crowdfunding? And I'll come back to the issue of crowdfunding just in a minute. So basically, before you start your process for your business, development of your product in your business, so could you run, for example, a crowdsourcing campaign or a hackathon event to rapidly develop your ideas? If you've got a basic idea, could you use open source methods to try and attract other ideas to improve your product? Or could you go to a makerspace or an innovation hub and do some sort of hackathon event to try and develop your idea faster? Could you go to a maker space or a fab lab or a hacker space to produce a prototype? Often these types of community making spaces will have access to equipment, and you can rent time on those machines where it doesn't necessarily cost you a lot of money, so you can produce your prototypes. You don't have to contract an organization to do that. There is now the advent of shared machines where you can use different machines that are housed in makerspaces. Could you use events or pop-up shops to test your idea? You develop a pop-up shop, maybe, again, if you're in a coastal area, maybe on the beachfront with your idea, and just get feedback from potential customers and users. And that feedback could be really useful to you. And could you launch a social media campaign to engage people in your program and supporters before you start? So you've got a community behind you before you launch. And then could you use a crowdfunding campaign to get supporters to test the commercial viability of the idea? Any thoughts or questions? All very quiet. Okay, well, I'll move on now to thinking about crowdfunding. Right, so there are broadly 4 types of crowdfunding. You've got donation-based crowdfunding, which is a pure donation. So somebody may just donate because they like your business idea, because it's got a social and environmental value to it. So there's a crowdfunding approach which is purely based on donations. You've got reward-based crowdfunding, where backers receive something tangible in return, such as a product or service. So they might back, 50 euros or 100 euros on the basis that they'll get, in effect, a free product when the business is launched. You've got loan-based crowdfunding that is based on peer-to-peer, a peer-to-peer loan approach between private lenders, and then equity-based crowdfunding, where investors will invest in unlisted companies. So there's different types of crowdfunding. And there are different types of crowdfunding platforms out there, and this is just a sample of crowdfunding platforms that are out there, and that you've got many growing in other countries, for example. So clearly, Kickstarter and Indiegogo are quite well known, but you have other different types of crowdfunding platforms. Kickstarter, Indiegogo, and Patreon are based on the reward-based platform idea. So you get something back, and then Funding Circle is based on the loan system, and Crowdcube is based on the equity-based model, where people take a share of the business. And if you're to develop a successful crowdfunding campaign, what are some of the things you need to do? And I'll go through each of these areas now. So if you're thinking about generating a certain amount to start your business. So the first thing to do is to develop your story. Why are you pursuing this project? What is the story of the product? How did it happen? What's the purpose of your campaign? What money are you trying to raise for what? And importantly, who are you? People like to know the people behind the brand, the personal story. How did you personally come up with your idea? Second thing to think about is videos and pictures. So research indicates that projects with videos or crowdfunding campaigns that use videos are more successful. And for the video that you might use for your crowdfunding campaign, is make that story personal and informal. and generally do not make it longer than about 3 minutes. So don't make it boring and long. Make it short and punchy with a personal story. But also on your campaign webpage with your video, also include photographs and other material. So you need to think about your target amount. How much are you actually trying to raise? And the average pledge from research is about 50 to 100 euros. And the average target amount for an overall crowdfunding campaign is about 5 to 10,000 euros. And then there are various choices between different types of crowdfunding campaigns, which I haven't got time to go into today. You need to think about how long your campaign will last. Will it last for 30 days? Will it last for 90 days? And you need to consider the resources that you put into the campaign. How much resources, how much time do you have? How much money do you have? Can you do a very short, intensive, 15, 20, 30-day campaign, or can you spread it over a longer period of time? You need to think about rewards. So this could be, anything from a handwritten thank you letter for somebody, committing some money to your product. But it also could be different types of rewards dependent on how much people invest. So different sort of incentives, if they put in, 10 euros, maybe you get a thank you letter. If they put in 500 euros, maybe you send them something. And also, if again, perhaps consider other types of rewards to try and get money in early. Large amounts of money are in early. Very important that you start the marketing of your crowdfunding campaign before the campaign starts. So you need to produce a plan of potential backers. Who are your target audience? Who are the people that might back your project? You need to make a list of these people, write them down. Organizations, bloggers, media, etc., who might be interested in your concept. And then you need to start to raise awareness of that you are going to be starting a crowdfunding campaign. And maybe you need to start writing blogs that you're going to be starting a campaign. So start to raise awareness of your crowdfunding campaign before you start it. Then use plenty of social media. Twitter, Facebook, start to raise awareness before you launch. When you launch the campaign, be quite proactive. Post daily updates, maybe on social media or every few days. How are you going? Have you got any good news stories? You might even consider your own small financial budget to do very targeted social media advertising on Facebook or Twitter or something. Continue to try and get new contacts. Also use different techniques to promote your campaign. Maybe you ring people up, key people up to say, we're running a crowdfunding campaign. Maybe you make leaflets that you distribute at events. Maybe if you're speaking at an event, you're also promoting your crowdfunding campaign. So use all sorts of communication tools to communicate your crowdfunding campaign. And make sure you keep a list of your initial backers and potentially even produce a little newsletter for them to keep them aware of how the campaign is going. So what we found was of the companies who basically have produced products on the market, quite a number have actually used crowdfunding. So a company called The Other Danish Guy has produced some underwear, I assume using perhaps EcoNile. I may have that wrong, but they produced a clothing product from, in effect, from fibers from the nets. And they used the Indiegogo crowdfunding platform. They attracted 230 funders who pledged $46,000, which was double their target of $20,000. Burio developed a very specific campaign to take forward the product development of the sunglasses that I mentioned earlier. They used Kickstarter, and they got commitments from nearly 1,400 funders who pledged around about 181,000 US dollars, which I can't even think about. Maybe that's 600% over their target. So quite a lot of money. Healthy Seas, again, that I mentioned earlier, to take forward their product, their sock product. They use a specialist crowdfunding campaign called One Planet Crowd, and they got 190 funders who pledged nearly 18,000 euros, again, over their target amount. And Fishy Filaments, who I mentioned several times, who are producing the filament for 3D printing, they used an equity-based crowdfunding campaign where the funders got a share of the business, I understand. And what that attracted is 407 funders who pledged over £200,000. Again, significantly over their target. So already we're starting to see, those startup companies, quite a proportion of in this new market, and it is a new market, quite a number of those actively using crowdfunding to generate their first, funding for their products. And I'll leave you just with a couple of brief thoughts. If your business is based in a port or port city area, don't forget there are other types of companies in your local area and organizations that you can collaborate with. So have a look to see, if they're plastics producers, or they're injection molders, or there are shredders, or there are maker spaces. So look at what's, the capacity is in your local area, and see if there are opportunities to collaborate with them. Are there universities or technical schools or something like that you could use equipment, share equipment, etc. So look at your local innovation system and how you could work with that group of organizations. Again, going right back to the beginning, we adapted our Eco-Innovate booklet that has had over 60,000 downloads to focus a new version that relates to fishing gear. And we have a report on the internet. And one thing that I leave with you, within the Circular Ocean project that I mentioned several times, what we also did ourselves was to run a series of, I called them the Net Hack Challenge. So this was a hackathon approach to produce products from the nets, working with design students. And what we did was we open sourced a whole series of concepts on the net for people to really take on board if they like those concepts, to work with those designers to take those ideas forward. So if you want to move into this area but you haven't got a good idea yet, please feel free to have a look at these initial concepts. And this could be a good way also to potentially work with some other designers and whatever in a collaborative manner. So any final questions or thoughts? Because I think I'm here roughly on time, 1 hour. Was that helpful to anybody? I still see 9 people. I see there's a question from Maeve starting. Hi, Martin. Is there any rest of a question there rather than hi, Martin? Okay. So Jan, okay, well, that's great. So yeah, any other thoughts or questions? from any other participants? What I should say is in the Blue Circular Economy project. So thank you, John. I really enjoyed the grand tour. Thank you. So within the Blue Circular Economy project, we're particularly working with startups and small companies in Ireland, Scotland, Norway, Iceland, and Sweden, in certain parts within the so-called Northern Periphery area. We'll be running a conference in Iceland and other stakeholder workshops in Galway in Ireland, and also in Ålesund in Norway. So again, if you're in any of those geographical areas, we can work with you more closely. We will be running other webinars, so if you found this helpful, please forward it to other colleagues, or if there was too much there, please feel free to attend again. So I saw another question from Marlon. Thank you very much. Now we need to develop a model for Africa. So Marlon, I have a colleague who is interested or two colleagues who are interested in the Africa side. One who's done some work in Malawi and some in Ghana. So if you are interested in that, please just email my colleague. Well, I'll just try and write my email here. If you send me an email, then I can connect you with those colleagues. Do you have any tips, experience with landlocked countries and how they can participate? No, it's a good question because, for example, some of the lakes in, as Marlon would know, you've got huge lakes in Africa or in China or whatever that, as you say, are landlocked. They've still got quite large fishing industries. So in many instances, they'll be facing the same sort of issues. So our project is explicitly focused on coastal areas. So, but yes, many of the issues will be appropriate for landlocked, players. So Maeve has put it here, working on an oyster bag reuse recycling bag for BIM in Ireland. People might note that there are many agencies involved in harbours, so may be prepared to have to deal with a number of stakeholders you're trying to sort. Yes, it's very complicated. Those systems are not very well organised. I attended the first stakeholder meeting in Ireland, in Cork, and that was the first time a lot of the major stakeholders had got together, many of whom have never talked to one another. So yes, it is very complicated, and that's what we're trying to do in Galway and also in Ålesund, is trying to bring the business stakeholders together with the fishing stakeholders, because often they will never have talked to one another. So what will be the opportunity for the new EPR legislation for SME? Well, it's unclear to me at this moment. I would say because I'd say briefly a couple of key points here. My understanding is that the European Commission have really taken the so-called extended producer responsibility scheme from the electronic sector and brought it into this sector. And in my opinion, they're very, very different sectors. So the difference between the two is in electronics, you've got national systems. In fishing nets, you've got coastal systems. In the electronic side, when the legislation came in, there were well-established systems, so you knew who the different players were. In the fishing side, very different. The producers, assemblers, and importers are not necessarily clear. There are, to my knowledge, no producer organizations in any member state at this stage. So it's a very new sector. I would say at this stage, if the EPRC systems are going to work, you're going to need there's going to need to be a massive expansion of recycling capacity in port city areas, because the producers will have to recycle those nets. They'll have to take back and repurpose and reuse and resell, or there's going to have to be a much greater increase in materials recyclers. So I would start to, if you're serious, start to focus in on that area, because there then may be even very specialist business opportunities, even around things like cleaning the nets and drying the nets. So some very basic businesses ideas may start to become business opportunities. So this is from Iris. Thank you, Martin. You give us some new important thoughts. Do you have any experience about the quality of fishing gear materials dependent on the different countries? Well, you know, what we've found is a lot depends. It's quite complicated. You've got different types of polymers, and the three dominant polymers are polypropylene, polyethylene, and nylon. You get different types of nets used at different levels for different types of fishing. So my understanding is that for the bottom trawling, you're using these polypropylene and polyethylene, and these nets, when they're landing, are often very contaminated, and there is many issues with them. So one of the big problems is the quality of materials, even if you land them. So there's still a lot more work to be done on that process of collection and classification. So it may be, you know that some of the fishing gear, when it's even landed, is just of so poor quality, it can't be reused as such. So there needs to be a lot more work done on this area. So how far are you with producing a precious plastic DIY recycling machine? Well, we got involved in a small project with Innovate UK money, and the partners basically were able to produce a handle that could be used for various products where you pick up things. So they could produce a handle. So something has been done, but it's very early stage. So yes, I did briefly mention Plastics Global when I mentioned the two. There's only two major recyclers. One is the chemical recycler, which is Aquafil, who are producing the EcoNile, and then Plastics Global, who are based in Denmark, are a mechanical recycler, and they're one of the two, let's say, relatively established recyclers in the whole of Europe. Various players have tried to move in, but as yet they haven't. Plastics Global are producing pellets. Now, there is another company, I understand, that is being set up in Norway, who now, even in Norway, that of course is the largest fishing country in the Greater Europe region. Even Norway, who had quite relevant, maybe slightly more established systems, they were exporting a lot of their fishing nets, but they now have a company that is also producing pellets from the fishing nets. But the problem they're facing is they can now technically produce the pellets, but they're struggling to get the markets for the pellets. So there's an issue around market development. So Plastics Global, they're run by a bit, I'd say a business guy who's maybe had quite a strong financial background, who's maybe been involved in quite a number of different businesses. I think they have attracted quite a lot of funding and have been quite high profile. I know they've had some challenges, but that's about as far as I know or understand. But the key thing is, the legislation has now been published in the official journal of the Commission. So this legislation is going to go forward, and the bottom line is, if we're going to continue to develop this extended producer responsibility scheme, there is going to be a need to build this recycling infrastructure. And at the moment, you've got let's say two significant players in the whole of Europe. So there's got to be a massive growth in the infrastructure to take back and recycle these these nets. And I think the second issue from participating in this stakeholder workshop in Ireland and also in Brussels is the producers need to get much more organised. There's a very competitive environment within fishing net manufacturers and assemblers. They're not used to talking to one another, but this issue is going to affect them all. So they need to start to really get their act together. So what kind of finances do you need to start this kind of? It's a good question. I don't have a direct answer to that, and that must be something, Tim. I'm not sure where you're based, but that's something that perhaps you should Rotterdam, the Netherlands. I'm sure Netherlands is going circular economy crazy, so I'm sure there may be some R&D funding may be available. Perhaps if you position this as a circular economy business idea. So I think that would be something you'd have to think through. The issue that I forgot to mention is what I experienced from the electronics sector is that when the legislation was developing for electronics, a lot of the then, maybe the early 2000s, a lot of the waste management companies that now have rebranded themselves as resource management companies did not want to invest in electronics recycling until the legislation was really, really 100% clear. So what I can see is going to happen here is a lot of the, investors will not invest in the market until the legislation is much clearer. So we might see suddenly at a point, various companies investing, et cetera, et cetera. But until the legislation is really clear, and still at the moment there is many, many questions, I think you're going to see people take a bit of a wait and see approach. So Tim, I think you need to perhaps think about that one, and I'm afraid you're going to need to think that one through yourself, or find some funding to help you think that through. So any further questions? Any further thoughts? Maybe in closing, maybe those that wish to could give me just one key point they got from the webinar. Just one key question, one key thought. And if you feel like doing that, that would be very helpful for me. And if not, I will close this off. So any final thoughts? Any final thoughts? Hopefully you found it useful. And, we probably will run the next session again in the end of August or in September. So, please feel free to, join again if it was too much there, or send to any colleagues. So for me, it got clear there is a demand for recycling fishing nets. Very motivating. Well, I think, Tim, I think the key thing there is there's this legislative change that is coming in. It is law, but it's going to take time to get clarity over that. There are products that are being made from the fishing nets, but at the moment there is only a few recyclers in business. One other, I'll just leave you with one thought, because in everything there are pluses and minuses. So despite legislation going to be developed, one example we came across in Scotland was that an organisation called Zero Waste Scotland looked at the feasibility of setting up a recycling plant for the fishing nets. And one of the problems they had was to get a good volume of fishing nets, because it's not clear necessarily when the fishing nets will come to the end of life. So there needs to be more predictability of the input of the nets into recycling process, if you see what I mean. So there needs to be more work done on that, and maybe within the legislation that will help to sort that part of the system out. So still many questions. And John here, thanks Martin, I'm starting to recycle ocean plastic in Ireland using the process back injection machine. I'll give you an update in a few months. Anybody on this group, please feel to contact me on John. Yeah, so John, also just Google Project Net Worth and Claire Potter Design. So they have they initiated the project that we work with them. So we work with them on the whole innovation aspect of developing workshops and the ideas process, and then they physically adapted the machines to use the nets and produce the handle. So there should be, I believe they did put something up as a blog or something. So Project Net Worth. So anyway, if there are any final thoughts or questions, please drop them in. And if not, I'll say good evening. And I hope there was at least one thing you found useful from the event. Oh, sorry, I did see one other question that I didn't answer. Only shredding, cleaning and drying is still difficult. Yes, this is absolutely true. What we found in Norway, in Alesund, when we ran a test of our stakeholder workshop, is that there was a very small recycler of the nets. They're not on any scale like Aquafil, and with Econile and plastic. But they had to travel, take the nets, something like 200 kilometers to a specialist shredder to shred the nets. There just wasn't the type of shredding equipment to deal with nets in the local area. So that's one of the other aspects is identifying your local innovation system and where key players sit. They may not be directly, in the port or coastal area. They may be outside the area, so you may need to work with others. And indeed, going back to Tim's point, maybe there's going to be, opportunities to set up shredding businesses purely for fishing nets, specialist ones, where maybe companies and the producers could actually rent time on that shredder. So I think, it's just starting to think these through. Are these machines known? What do you need? What do you mean? I don't know what you mean, Tim, by your question. Can you clarify your question? Are these machines known? I think it's not so well known. There was another project that WWF Germany ran in the Baltic area, and they worked with some pretty hardcore shredding equipment that they adapted for fishing nets. And I think Burio have similarly adapted a shredder for their manufacturing facility. So there is relatively little information on cleaning. There is something that I cannot remember what the source of it is, but there is a checklist produced in Canada just simply on cleaning the nets. What I would suggest is that anybody that's interested looks at the Circular Ocean website, because there's a lot of useful information there. For example, we produce reports on 3D printing and fishing nets. Also, to start to follow the Blue Circular Ocean project, Blue Circular Economy project, and lastly, to also connect up with the Global Ghost Gear Initiative. So they're a global NGO that is focused on trying to find solutions to the fishing net problem. I sit on the advisory board for this. So, just contact them, and I'm sure they'd be happy to help. So I think we really have to finish up now. So any last questions or last thoughts? And then we'll close down. So it looks like no further thoughts. So thank you very much for your time and all those questions at the end. Each session is different. Some people put questions on the time, but for the first time ever, this question, I had an avalanche of questions at the end. So anyway, please feel free to contact me or follow those organizations, and thank you very much for your time.